right.
do it.
Anna Pidgorna, thank you so much for joining me today. I wish that we were talking under different circumstances. We should have done this well before this, and
I know.
I want you to know that the door is always open in the future if you ever want to come back on and chat about other things.
Awesome.
But I want to spend most of the time today just listening and asking dumb questions, if that's okay, because
Please.
you are the first person that I ever worked with who is of Ukrainian descent and introduced me to some Ukrainian music that I have zero cultural relationship to. I grew up in a cornfield in Ohio, and sort of to play with, I think it was 2000, what year was that?
2015. Yeah.
Feels like ages ago, but it was only 7 years ago. And I have these the piece was called Weeping for
a Dead Love.
For a Dead Love. And I listened through it last night, and I was struck by a lot of things, and I would love for you to talk about that music. I kind of don't know where to start, other than to just tell me a little bit about yourself, and sort of where your background, and then we'll go from there. I mean, there's the obvious topic of the war in Ukraine right now that I want to touch on, but I don't have an agenda here. I kind of want to just go where you want to go. But why don't you tell me, if that's okay with you, why don't you tell me a little bit about your background and sort of like what brought you to this, to today, basically.
Yeah, so I was born in Ukraine when it was still the Soviet Union, 1985. In 91, Ukraine became independent, and there was a really difficult time economically as, all the Soviet industry collapsed. So in 97, my parents and I and my sister, we immigrated to Canada. And settled in like the greater Vancouver region where my parents have been this whole time. So I finished high school here. I did my undergrad and master's in Canada, and then went to Princeton University for my PhD, which is how we know each other, because I think you guys started your residency there. So Percussion started their residency the same year that I started, I believe.
That's probably right, yeah.
Yeah. I didn't do any music in Ukraine. That wasn't really part of my family or opportunities that I was getting. So I only started music in Canada and got into it in a very kind of amateur way, like through guitar lessons and high school band and jazz band. So by the time I started university, I could basically barely read music. So there was a lot to catch up on. And then I became interested in Ukrainian folk music kind of towards the end of my undergrad. And really, in my master's is when I traveled to Ukraine for 3 months to go around villages on a Canada Council for the Arts grant. Thank you, Canada Council. So I went around villages, staying in the homes of elderly women and recording them, and I was accompanied by a Ukrainian folk singer and ethnomusicologist, Irina Danileko, who is in Ukraine right now, living through all of this horror. So these women just opened their homes to me and my sister, and they told us a lot of stories and fed us and sang. So it was really amazing. And this experience truly had a really transformative effect on my practice as a composer. I started incorporating a lot of those folk idioms into my instrumental writing, kind of trying to capture the grittiness of the sound, which is so in contrast with this kind of like clean classical sound of the Mozart era, But I was also interested in the particular vocal quality. Just the singing uses a different kind of timbre, and it varies throughout the country. It's not like all the same style. And I really wanted to be able to incorporate that into my work, but to find a singer who can sing like that, but who's also trained in the classical way and can read a score, it's virtually impossible. Well,
I'm sorry to
But
interrupt. I mean, that's one of the things as
yeah.
I was listening back last night, I kept trying to think to myself, like, do people just pick this piece up and play it? Like, I feel like you really have to know, like, Anna is singing stuff that she's clearly been in the living room of someone who taught her this song, like, or
I mean,
has,
no one else has performed it. Only I have performed it, and I've done it with
Yeah.
other percussion quartets, and I really love performing the piece. It's quite cathartic. But yeah, I can't imagine a classically trained singer doing it. It's just it would be not the same effect. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's authenticity there. I mean, I don't. I'm trying to think of what in my life has that same exact sort of gravitas to it, and it's like there's a particular ownership of that language and that, especially just singing in different language. I can learn I can learn Italian and try to sing some Italian words, but like I've never spoken Italian to anyone. So like, what am I singing? What's the context? What's the intent behind what it is I'm singing? And that's something you clearly had when we were working together, and so. I'm trying to imagine you teaching that all to somebody else who has no connection to Ukrainian, funeral culture and what those words mean and why they're being sung. But can I ask you? So you were 7 or 12 when you moved to
12.
Canada. Is that 12?
12. Yeah.
One of the things I'm struck by as I try to be a student of history and learn a bit about the fall of the Soviet Union and not even just that particular time, but all of the things that led to that. Like, it wasn't just like the Soviet Union fell. There was stuff that happened 80 years prior to that were set up post World War I and World War II and all these things. I'm curious, as a 12-year-old, when you were moving, like how much of that was something that you were aware of? Like, did your parents talk about it? Was it I'm just kind of curious, what was in the air as a 12-year-old when you were sitting around the dinner table listening to what they were talking about? What were the conversations like?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I'm trying to think back. My father comes from a more Ukrainian-speaking background. He had family in the countryside where the language continued uninterrupted, so he speaks Ukrainian very, very fluently. And he heard the kind of music that I was later recording. He heard it, in his village. So that's really his culture. And he was not like an active dissident of the Soviet Union. He wasn't out there trying to fight the government, but, he also was not a believer of the system. And he was very interested in Ukrainian history, which, both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union really changed in order to fit their own narrative, right? Like, you control the history and you control how the people see themselves.
Tell me a little bit more drill down on that for me, because as somebody, I grew up in Ohio. Yes, there are parts of history that got recontextualized and told to me in certain ways, but the degree to which that happened, it just wasn't as much of a thing for me in Ohio as it was. Like, what exactly?
Of course not. Yeah,
right,
of course it wasn't a thing for you.
I'm saying the most obvious thing there, but like, I have no in there. Like, so tell me exactly, like, what exactly do you mean by when you say that?
Yeah, so I guess the most major thing is that, there was a major kind of kingdom around Kyiv in the Middle Ages. Kyiv was one of the largest cities in Europe at that time, and it had connections with all over Western Europe. In fact, a famous Ukrainian princess married into the French royalty. She was Queen Anna, actually, I think. And there's memorials to her in Paris, and I believe even she was literate and her husband wasn't. So there's evidence, there's a document with their two signatures, and I think his is essentially just some mark on the paper, and hers is she wrote her entire name. Wow. So that was Ukraine, it wasn't called Ukraine, it was called Kievan Rus. That was that
Kievan
area.
Rus?
Kievan Rus.
Okay, all right.
So that is what my people come from, but the Russian Empire, or Muscovy at that time, it started as Muscovy around Moscow. Basically, they needed to build legitimacy around themselves when they started looking at the West, and they wanted to be an equal player with all the kingdoms in the West. They started to claim that Kievan Rus was their root, as if like all of the kind of nobility of Kievan Rus just like went north for whatever reason, and then established itself in Moscow. So Russia continues to claim that Kievan Rus is their history, and this is why they lay claim on Ukraine. They think that Ukraine should be part of Russia because it is their history.
Well, I mean, and this is, the reason I asked that question, when I think about the regional history, to me, the things that pop up, only because that's what I know, are like the Treaty of Versailles and post-World War II, and like the way that land got sort of like chopped up in order to create a barrier so that the West was, all of these non-aggression treaties, like all these things. But of course, that area, the history of that area is like thousands of years old. And when I see people online talking about like, oh, why is Ukraine important? Like this, that's why I asked the dumb question, because this isn't just Putin randomly deciding, oh, I think Ukraine might be nice to have. Like,
they've been trying to have Ukraine for hundreds of years, basically.
Right. And looking at Putin as this like singular person who's like making a decision. Not real. It's like no. He's in a long line of czars that have been thinking like this, and we look at him in the same way we might look at one of our presidents, and it's like that you can't. Like
no.
Like he's not the same figure that Obama or even Trump. Like Trump is in a lineage of presidents who are democratically elected. We can think what we want about Trump, but like he doesn't come from a line of czars.
Yeah. Yeah,
and
that's right.
That distinction to me keeps smacking me in the face, and I'm surprised that we aren't. I'm surprised that people are surprised, and when I talk to you, you don't seem very surprised, and that's kind of why I asked the question. Am I misdiagnosing anything there? Like,
yeah, I can't say that I was necessarily aware of all this as a 12-year-old, but this is something, just as I was growing up. This was definitely a conversation in my home, especially coming from my dad. My mother's side of the family comes from a very Russianized part of the country, southern Ukraine. The city is called Kherson, which has been in the news lately. It's been occupied by Russian troops. Though we just saw videos last night, people came out in the thousands with Ukrainian flags to protest against Russian troops. Like, this is insane. People are so brave. Anyway, but this region, it was really, really colonized by the Russian Empire during Catherine the Great. So it's a very Russian-speaking part. So my mom really grew up more immersed in that kind of Soviet and Russian culture. So my family speaks Russian at home, though we are increasingly switching to Ukrainian for obvious reasons, because, we don't want to be rescued by Russia. Well, that's the thing. Right now in Kherson, the people are coming to the streets and they're yelling at the Russian soldiers, like, listen to us, we're speaking in Russian. No one oppressed us here. We don't want Russia here. Go home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I was struck by, and sorry to keep sort of honing in on this moment of the Soviet era, like the ending of the Soviet era, but one of the first gigs that I played with percussion early on in my time was in Odessa, and we was at the Potemkin Steps, and all of these, just everything to me felt massive, and I was just like, I remember walking around Odessa and just being like, wow, like this is just bonkers. All this stuff is so big, and then you start to see. It was the first place where I felt like the town was trying to hide a reality in a weird way. A lot of the buildings had a scrim in front of them that had a picture of what the building should look like. But the building wasn't functional anymore, and like so there was all this weird, like it looked beautiful, but as soon as you got close enough to it, you were like, wait a minute, that's a scrim in front of that building. And then the hotel we stayed in, they had a plaque that was framed that said no water. Like it was like framed from like the 80s. Like this, and it wasn't, nobody even addressed it like when we checked in. And as a, in 2008, there's no value judgment here, but as a 2008, 26-year-old kid, I was like,
water?
Where are we right now? Yeah. And I didn't know really much about, and so then, you talked to, I remember I said thank you in Russian to one of the students, and she sort of pulled me aside and taught me a little bit of Ukrainian to be like, just so you know, you might get a few less stink eyes if you say this than this, And I started to think like, wow, I had never been to a place like that. And so can you tell me like what were the effects, like the direct effects that happened when the Soviets left? I got the sense there that there was this like pride, but also clearly they had been abandoned and no one was coming to help fix anything. And I was like kind of baffled.
You mean when the Soviet Union fell apart?
When I say abandoned, I don't mean like like infrastructure. Like it just felt like there was no support there, and it felt like everybody was kind of on their own,
I mean, it's not like the Soviets left, right? I mean, the Soviets were all part of the system. It's just they were all still there. It's just the system collapsed, and we started trying to build a new life according to the capitalist model. But it doesn't happen overnight.
Right,
and
right.
all of those, a lot of Soviet industry was really far behind. Basically, it couldn't compete with the West. It wasn't putting out goods at the same level, at the same technology level. Also, a lot of those factories were oriented towards military production. Like that was the primary focus, and the consumer goods were a kind of side gig for a lot of these factories. So then, when the Soviet system fell apart, then suddenly all this industry is non-competitive, and then there were all of this corruption around how it got privatized. So basically, some people gathered enormous wealth. So what should have been what technically belonged to everyone now belonged to a number of oligarchs. So that obviously didn't help. And then just, people had to completely change careers in many cases. Like there were university academics selling cabbages in the market because at that moment no one needed university academics. So it was the 90s were a really difficult time where it's like, like you had to think about where your food was coming from. Like my parents said one summer they sent me and my sister to stay with my grandparents, and then they were essentially living off like whatever they were growing at their little patch of land. So
I mean, I asked the question out of ignorance a little bit, but also out of trying to clock, I think, my own and our own privilege as Americans, that like, we see history in these weird episodic like 20-year chunks, and we're like, oh well, this could never happen, and this system is, well, this is the way it always works, right? And capitalism is the way that's what happens, right? And you never really question the way in which you got to a situation. And
right.
What was it, 5 years ago, President Zelensky was embroiled in a impeachment trial in the U.S., and we were all like, oh, well, this is, everybody took sides, and it was like, well, and now Zelensky's wearing a flak jacket, and you can think whatever you want about him, but it is apparent that our two systems are not the same. And one of them would never allow for one of our presidents, no matter what we think of either one of them, to be in a flak jacket, hiding in a basement, making Molotov cocktails. Yeah. And one system, whether it wants to allow it or not, that's where it is. And I just, as a 42-year-old man, all of these things, like now I'm thinking about the conversations I had in Ukraine of like, okay.
Yeah.
That young girl pulling me aside is like connected to 1,000 years ago. In some small way, this stuff is all woven together and connected. We aren't separated from Catherine the Great, really. I mean, that was a couple people ago.
Yeah, and no one really frames it this way in the West, but Ukraine was colonized. Ukraine was colonized by a number of the empires that were around it, and chunks of it were changing hands multiple times. It was colonized for resources because it is the breadbasket of Europe. It has really rich soil. It has a lot of natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a colony, and the language was suppressed the way that the indigenous languages of North America have been suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
When people tried to protest, they were repressed very heavily. That's why we had that enormous famine in 1933, where I believe around 8 million people died. That's colonization.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about everything you're saying and trying to formulate some sort of coherent question. One thing I'm curious about is, the mainstream media right now, and when I say mainstream, I'm trying not to say that in the way that everybody talks about. There are good versions of media and there are bad versions, but I would say even the best versions of the media right now are forced into this 24-hour news cycle. Everything's prepackaged, pre-produced, and curated with a headline that gets the most clicks, and the headline changes 10 minutes later if it isn't getting enough clicks. And it makes me very scared of what I'm being told about what's happening in Ukraine. Texted a good friend of mine who teaches at USC, and he was telling me the first words out of his mouth were that Putin was going to drop a nuke on Chernobyl. That thought never even crossed my mind. And it wasn't coming. I wasn't seeing those. No one was talking about it in the news, and I was like, "Wait a minute!" But mutually assured destruction, right? And he's like,
"He doesn't give a shit."
Right, and it's now a week later. We're starting to hear some people talk about why is Putin in Chernobyl, and it's like, oh my God, this is such.
And Ukrainians have been like, "Europe, Putin's in Chernobyl. Come on!"
Right, and yes, he may try to nuke it and create a nuclear disaster there, but it's also psychological warfare. Chernobyl was run by the Russians. That's why we know it as Chernobyl, because it melted down and they didn't tell anybody, and they hid it. Yeah. And they forced their own people to go in and shovel uranium chunks out.
Well, and the thing is, you don't even have to nuke it. You just shoot at it, and it does the rest. And it's not just Chernobyl.
Right.
They've been fighting over other nuclear power plants. There are multiple power plants in Ukraine. There is, I believe the one in Zaporizhia is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. And there's been several days of fighting around it. Like, the Russian troops are shooting at a nuclear power plant because they're that stupid.
I mean,
it's like they don't even have the education to understand that you can't shoot at a nuclear power plant.
In terms of, I want to ask you, what are the things, clearly Russian soldiers aren't even being told what they're doing and why they're doing it. Some of them are texting their moms and being like, wait a minute, I'm on the border of Kiev right now, and why are we here, And so,
that's also really unclear. We look at it with a bit of skepticism because for so many of them, the story comes out in such the same way. It really feels like that's what they're being told to say in order to not be killed and when they're taken prisoner. So I don't know. We're taking it with a grain of salt. Some of these kids really do seem I look at them oh my God, this poor kid. He has no idea. He's badly equipped. He's obviously undertrained. It looks like he can barely hold a gun. But yeah, we are looking at that with a grain of salt.
Well, in that context, then, so what are some things that are not being, or what are some things that are being misreported in the media by your estimation? And then what are some things that just aren't being reported that you feel is really important that folks know?
Well, to be honest, I haven't been keeping up with the Western reporting too closely because there's just so much information coming our way. We have our own channels of information. There are, the apps Viber and Telegram that are similar to WhatsApp. Well, they're more popular in Ukraine. So there are actual like channels where updates get posted all the time about things that are happening. Like, for example, if there's air raid siren somewhere, or if there's bombing somewhere, or if some chunk of a city was retaken. But also mixed in with like international news of like, this is what's happening with sanctions. It's just like this dump of information constantly, or like videos of a Russian airplane getting shot down, or a video of a Ukrainian tractor pulling a Russian tank. It's like just this like stream of information. So that's mostly what our family's been following, with just like occasionally dipping into Western news just to see what like, what people out here are saying. I mean, largely, I think the reporting has been good. There's been a few concerns in terms of the kind of counter propaganda that Russia's trying to put into it. So, one thing that started circulating was that there were apparently like Nazi flags at Ukrainian rallies, and what they were referring to were these black and red flags of the UPA. It's like the Ukrainian, I forget, Ukrainian People's Army or something like that. I forget what the acronym stands for. But it was essentially a guerrilla fighting group in World War II who were fighting both against the Soviets and against the Nazis. And then when the war ended, they continued guerrilla warfare against the Soviets for like a good 10 years after the end of the war. And of course, Soviet Union painted them as fascists because they were fighting Soviet Union. And that's like, in the Soviet Union, the worst thing you could be is a fascist or a Nazi, because, we fought them in World War II. And yet now Germans are helping us defend Kiev from Russians. Like, it's like, the irony is insane.
Yeah. It's just so, I mean,
I know, right?
It's so amazing how fast things switch and can turn,
But yeah, so people have been bringing the flags of that Liberation Army to some of the rallies, and then some Western media, probably being pushed by Russia, has picked it up and said, oh, Ukrainians are bringing Nazi symbolism or fascist symbolism, nationalist symbolism to these rallies. But so that's one thing to watch out. Then I remember there was some article circulating that apparently like students of African descent who were fleeing Ukraine right now are claiming that Ukrainians were racist towards them. And it's like, okay, who are we pointing our fingers at? As if there's no racism against black people everywhere else in the world? Like, like what is this information supposed to tell us? What, that Ukraine deserves to be bombed because maybe some people were racist? And like, I mean, I'm not justifying racism, but I'm just putting it in context of like the world, right?
I think context is key for almost everything, and it's you have to factor in the fact that there's a war being fought, and so yes, an act of racism is in context in that moment, and also may not be true.
Yeah, exactly. Well, like, I have no idea. I have no way to verify this. And I guess another thing that I don't think the West has reported on a lot at all, because, well, frankly, I don't think Western countries have any context for this. It's just like the sense of humor that's around. Like Ukrainians have a really dark sense of humor. And, oh my, you should see the humor that is circulating through our community, like, and within Ukraine, just to do with this war.
Like what? I love, well, to be clear, I love comedy, and I am obsessed with almost all comedy, but dark comedy in particular, I'm down with all day.
I mean, a lot of it right now, it's very dark, because, like, people are very angry at the Russian troops, obviously, so there's a lot of humor to do with their destruction, of course, and because, I mean, right now, like, I didn't think I would ever be in this place, but before going to bed, to make myself feel better, I watched videos of Russian helicopters being shot down. because that makes me feel better, you know? Like, that's where I am right now. So there's there's humor to do with that, but there's also things like I don't know, like, there's one thing circulating from Twitter that, like, a woman in Kiev took out a Russian drone by throwing a jar of pickles at it. I mean, that's hilarious, right? But
well, there's a slang term for Molotov cocktails too that I saw.
Oh yeah, the Bandera smoothies.
What is that? What does the term mean?
Oh yeah, I should put that in context. So Bandera was again one of these Ukrainian freedom fighters who emerged in around World War II, I believe, or maybe even earlier. I should know this history better, but yeah, he was also fighting against the Soviets, so he was like enemy number one. Associated with Ukrainian culture, and Russians use the word like banderovets, so like the person who's like associated with Bandera, as an insult against Ukrainians, and that implies that that again has these fascist undertones, that if you're a supporter of Bandera, then you're a fascist. So right now Ukrainians have like a lot of Ukrainians who previously might have been distancing themselves from that figure because he had nationalist leanings, like he was fighting for the independence of his country, right? So now everyone's taken up that label with pride, and so I guess this is like one example of a really dark joke, but that's really funny in this context. It's like a tiny dialogue, and someone from Russia says, you're a Bandera supporter and a fascist," and the person in Ukraine replies, "I know, our whole synagogue is like this." And you have to put that in context. Like, this is after Russia bombed a major Holocaust memorial site, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, and this is the irony too. Like, am I wrong? That is Zelensky Jewish?
He is, yeah.
Right. I mean, and this is when I saw prior to the invasion, there was a statement both by Putin and then by the Chinese government that sort of like supported what Putin said. I was talking about like, we are going to root out neo-Nazis, and I was like, hold on. Let me Google Zelensky real quick here. I think he probably has a vested interest in that. You might could team up with him if that's really what you want to do. Like,
and he's also a Russian speaker, like,
right. But what I heard there in that statement was a ton of red flags went off for me, because what I heard was, I think he was talking to us. I mean, I think he's talking to American culture, which he's been doing via social media for the last 6 years. He has been staging women's rights protests next to Nazi protests, setting them up via Facebook bots and creating discontent in the U.S. that isn't real. Like, and the idea, and he's trying to gin us up over here to get like, wait a minute, there's Nazis? There's nothing worse in America than a Nazi. Just ask the far left. We like to punch them. And it's like, we got Proud Boys, and like, it's like all of a sudden now we're all like, you know what? Yeah, Zelensky, get out those Nazis.
Well,
that's what I heard in that statement.
Yeah, I know. But this is something that Zelensky himself pointed out. It's like, how can Ukraine be a Nazi country when it lost, I think, close to 8 million people to Nazi Germany? Like, I believe percentage-wise, in terms of like in relation to population, I think Ukraine had the highest losses in World War II.
I mean,
so how can this country be Nazi? Like, it's,
I mean, I'm with you here 100%. I'm just saying, like, that it's straight up state propaganda. You hear it from North Korea when they say that their leader doesn't go to the bathroom because he's so magical. Like, that's just as crazy a thing as for Putin to say, we're going into Ukraine to get out the neo-Nazis. It's like, states say things to get through the next 5 minutes all the time.
Well, and this isn't just 5 minutes. Like, Putin has been preparing this whole package of propaganda the whole time he's been leader. He seems to have some sort of personal hatred against Ukraine. Like this is just, it's like personal.
Well, speaking of, I mean, just to get personal a little bit here, you were mentioning over Messenger about some family you have that are fleeing Kiev, and I'm curious, can you tell me specifically about just who those people are? Like, how are you related? What do they do for a living? Like, what shows did they watch? Like when you were growing, like what are they like? I mean, I don't want to assume this. I don't want to see this person only as somebody who's now a badass making Molotov cocktails. That's not what they grew up in their life setting out to do. They have other interests in the world. Like what's your family like that's there right now?
Yeah, so in Kiev, that's my mother's brother's family. So my uncle himself is actually in Slovenia right now because he works there, but his wife and his wife's sister and their mother are in Kiev. And they're living in one of these like very typical Soviet concrete block apartment buildings that like looks like every other apartment building you see in the former Soviet Union countries. So basically, because the mother is disabled, they haven't been able to go to any bomb shelters because there's just like when the air raid siren goes off, they wouldn't have enough time to get there. Like they can't even get her down the stairs. But yesterday we kind of had a bit of a panic because, Putin has changed tactics recently because his military campaign's not working the way he expected. He expected to take Kiev in 2 days. He thought that by February 26th, everything would be over, but it's already 10 days in and it's not over. So now he's starting to bomb residential areas directly. Now it's like not even just accidentally hitting residential areas, it's directly. So, we panicked a bit, and my aunt and her sister decided to try to flee. So they found some bus that was going just in the direction of the west, like not even clear where, just wherever it can get to. And a friend of theirs was trying to drive them to the bus, but their elderly mother got so sick in the car that they just couldn't keep going. They had to turn around. So they're back in Kiev right now. Yeah. So that's the other thing. It's like there are so many people, like especially people my parents' age, like their friends who are stuck in place because they have elderly relatives that they can't move.
I mean, my father was handicapped at the end of his life in a wheelchair, and
can you imagine being in the middle of a war zone with him?
Just to, again, no value judgment here, but when I think of the infrastructure of the U.S. compared to the infrastructure of Kiev in terms of handicap access to places.
Oh yeah, handicap access is awful over there. Absolutely.
Right. And so I just can't imagine trying to figure that out. And what are they doing? What are their conversations like during the day? Like how do people in that situation, and pardon my lack of a better phrase here, how do people keep their shit together?
Well,
what are they what are they doing? Are they reading books? Are they playing Sudoku? Like, and I don't mean to be glib here.
Yeah,
but
no, I know.
I'm trying to rack my brain of what would I do? Like, I think I just.
It's funny you mentioned Sudoku because one of the things my grandpa misses right now are his crossword puzzles that he used to get from his newspaper that he picked up every morning. But there are no print newspapers on sale right now, so he doesn't have his crosswords. And he said, they help keep his mind calmer. So he doesn't have that right now. But yeah, I mean, what are they in Kiev? Their life right now. So they scotch taped all of their windows because it helps a little bit if the windows get blown out from a nearby blast. You're hoping that the shards of glass are not going to fly everywhere. That's the biggest concern. They've also saran wrapped all their mirrors. They have like tubs, plastic containers of water in their tub just in case.
Where
But
do they,
yeah,
where do they
and
get their food? Like when you get up and you're like, I want to have a cup of coffee and have breakfast. Where does that happen?
so in Kiev, the grocery stores, or some of them, are still miraculously functioning. So actually, the city is functioning. That's the thing. Like, there's water and electricity so far, at least. I think there's even public transit to some extent, like wherever possible. So between, like, when there isn't an active air raid siren or active warnings to stay inside, they are able to go to the grocery store or to the pharmacy. Like, that's still available. Like, I mean, there are some issues with supplies, but there's still food. The city where my family is in southern Ukraine, in Kherson, the one that's been occupied, thankfully they at least weren't getting bombed as badly as Kharkiv. So it was quiet, but they were having issues already. Like, food was running out in the grocery stores. The grocery stores were nearly empty. And then when the Russian troops arrived, they also robbed the stores because they don't have enough of their own food. So my family is stocked up. They have things. My grandfather is a man of his routines. So he's 84, and still he basically has to go out almost every morning to, like, pick up his, like, try to find the things he normally goes to find.
I will. One thing I learned. This is a total non sequitur, but one thing I learned during the pandemic about myself was that I needed to get out of the house and go somewhere once a day and talk to a total stranger. That was something I never thought I would have in my life. Like,
yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, like I need to get out and do this, like go to these 4 places and then come home. And so I'm empathizing with your grandpa. Like I really identify with that desire. I don't care if there's a war or a pandemic, I am going out to get my crossword and I'm coming home.
I mean, like, literally some days ago, there was intense fighting over control of a major bridge that goes into the city, which is what would connect the road from Crimea, which is Russian occupied, into Kherson. And in that moment, the Ukrainian troops fought off the Russians on that bridge. But, like, there was, like, all night, there was, sounds of explosions. There was, like, very active fighting. But by the morning, it had calmed down. So my grandfather set out to find his daily newspaper, and he couldn't find one in all the kiosks nearby because they were all closed for some reason, So then he got on a bus and he went to the center of town to see if they were selling newspapers. They were also closed. He said everything was closed. It was very empty on the streets.
Well, I mean, I think, and we were laughing because it's funny, but also, like, there is another. Your grandfather is different than you and me, for many reasons. But one of them is that he just has seen more shit than you and I have, and so.
Well, he was a child in World War II,
right?
And that city was occupied by Germans for several years.
And so and he was a young man during the fall of the Soviet Union, like. And he was, and so, like, your grandpa's just had more at bats at this. Like, he's been at the plate a lot more than you and I have swinging the bat against all these crazy pitches.
It's true. And I mean, he is really stressed out. I don't want to underplay that. He is nervous. He's stressed out. So we're calling him every day and kind of trying to bolster morale, for sure. But despite that, he's still, like, he has his routines and he has to do things his way. So, like, his sister will call him and be like, Yura, there are warnings. There's an air raid siren. You have to get in your tub and cover yourself with a blanket. And he says, well, I just sat down to dinner. My dinner's gonna get cold. My vodka is gonna get warm. I can't let that happen. So he says, So I finished my dinner, I drank my vodka, and then I went to bed.
Well, there is something, there's no better way to demonstrate dissent during a war than getting on a bus and going to get your crossword puzzle. Like, there's a weird
Yeah,
form of protest there that I find oddly
it's true.
human. That
It's
in
true.
the banality of, or in the sort of chaos and intense flash of war, the banality of humanity, the fact that that must keep going, to me is,
Oh yeah, you have to keep living, right?
that's
Somehow.
your grandpa is
Oh,
the reason wars don't continue, is because if everybody just stopped doing that, then you've ceded everything. You've ceded control of everything. Sure, bomb that
it's true.
building, but god damn it, my crossword puzzle is going to be fresh and my vodka is going to be cold. If you're going
Yeah,
to blow 'em, and like that I feel is like this weird distillation of what it means to be alive and be a human being and deal with chaos. And so
it's true.
I wish I could have your grandpa on the podcast and just pick,
I
pick his
know.
brain. He sounds like a rad guy.
He's great. This makes me think too. There's another. I guess there is a certain thing in Western media that I would like to push back against a little bit.
Mhm.
So there's been quite a bit of Western reporting on just like how people are trying to protest in Russia, but it's so dangerous. Look, they're being thrown in jail. And it's true, they are. And even kids, like they're arresting children for
Right.
protesting. It's ridiculous. And in a way, I don't want to like downplay the danger they're facing, but I just want to put that in contrast. Like, so first of all, it's a really minuscule percentage of the Russian population who is actually brave enough to go out on the streets. Most of them aren't, and most of them actually don't even believe that a war is happening in Ukraine. Like, we have reports of people who have relatives in Ukraine, and they don't believe that Ukraine is being attacked. So,
And
I just want everyone to be clear on this, that most Russians right now, it's not that they're too afraid to go to protest. They don't see a need because they still believe that Russia is only engaging in a limited military operation. They don't believe that Russia is bombing civilians. They don't know any of this. They don't even believe their own relatives. So
yeah,
that's one thing I want to say. And another thing to do with that is even just this glorification of the people who are actually going out to protest. Like, I thank them, and they should be doing this, but to contrast that to what happened in Kherson last night, it's a city occupied by Russian troops. There are tanks, there are people with machine guns. Thousands of people there came out to protest on the streets yesterday, covered in Ukrainian flags. The Russian soldiers were shooting into the air to try to disperse them, and possibly shooting at people. I haven't heard exactly yet if there were any deaths from this, but I've seen videos of the protest and you can hear shooting. And like, can you imagine the bravery that requires? Like, what is being thrown in jail against this? That people are standing up in front of tanks. People are stopping tanks with their bare hands and like keeping them from passing through their village. Like this, like that is bravery. That is just insane bravery. And I don't know how much of that is being reported in the Western media. I'm not sure.
Truth be told, I try to stay off the news as much as I can because it's just like
It's horrible.
drinking out of a fire hose that has nothing but like old stale water in it, just constantly, you know. But I will say that there's a few reports of that I have seen enough that I feel like it's being touched on. I wouldn't say that, but I've seen a lot of reports. There are a lot of reports that seem to be like trying to imply that the Russians are opposed to this too. I'm seeing a lot.
Some
Right.
are, but it's
Right.
just such a small percentage.
But I think the perception over here on the media, at least in terms of what I've seen, is that the vast majority of Russians are not supportive of this, and Putin's really dropping the ball here because he's misreading what his public actually supports.
I think
you
that's
know.
optimistic because I also have Russian friends that I'm talking to quietly. And I keep asking them, please, you have to like spread information through your people. And they say, Anna, it's pointless. They don't believe us. Like, they don't believe us.
Yeah.
Like, one woman I was talking to yesterday, a Princeton physics student, she said, my whole family in Russia are in the military. They think that I'm a foreign agent. So I think it's a bit exaggerated in the Western media how much no war sentiment is in Russia.
Yeah, and again, this ties in with, I have conversations about, you know, the January 6th insurrection with people who there's nothing I can say to them,
Yeah.
What that says to me is that, like, that's a symptom of, yes, people often make bad decisions and stick to them when they shouldn't, but also people learn really bad information from
The
places.
propaganda is insane.
And
yeah,
the
propaganda is insane.
primacy effect, like what you hear first, is so hard to disentangle once it's there, once it's in and if all you're told, if the very first thing you're told in your newspaper is X, Y, and Z about what's going on in Ukraine, and that's all you're seeing, and every time you turn on RT, the only reports you're hearing are, it's like, if you only watch Fox News or if you only watch MSNBC, there are times of the year, the last couple of years, if you only watched MSNBC, you would think that there were MAGA hat wearing people racing through every street in the rural Midwest. Not true.
Right.
Just objectively not true. If you watch Fox News on the wrong day, you would think that the Black Lives Matter people are burning down every building in the U.S. Also not true.
Right.
Right. And so, like, those are the two arguments that are being pitted against each other. And in Russia, I imagine it's not so different. And so, like,
Russia has intense control over media, right?
Right,
so,
right.
And up until this point, it's not like they closed down the internet. People had access to the internet, and frankly, they could have found all this information very easily. But I don't know, a lot of people choose to, as they say, to be apolitical, which means that they just don't look at anything and they just focus on their daily lives because, like, they're so terrified of going back to the chaos of the 90s that they're willing to look away from all of this just to make sure that they have a comfortable life.
Yeah.
But I think this is something that I'm really realizing right now, like slowly over the last couple of years, but right now especially, is that there's no such thing as being apolitical. When you say you're apolitical, it just means that you leave yourself open to propaganda. Because information is still coming your way, but you're accepting it absolutely passively without thinking. So, but by doing that, you are following someone else's politics. You're not apolitical, you're following politics. So one prime example of this was one of my mom's closest friends in Ukraine. She is of Russian descent, but she's been in Ukraine since her 20s. So she's one of the people right now making Bandera smoothies to defend herself against Russian troops. That's the irony. Her daughter lives in Russia. This daughter, she's about my age. She grew up in Ukraine. Her parents are still in Ukraine, but she moved to Russia a few years ago. Up until this attack started, she believed that Ukraine was the aggressor in everything that was ramping up.
Yeah.
And her parents live in Ukraine. And her daughter, she styles herself as someone who's apolitical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you two more questions, and then you have a way more stressful day-to-day life these days than I do, and I want to be respectful of that. And so I want to ask you just two more questions. How do you see this ending? Like, I ask that, it's sort of not. I don't need, like, on this date this is probably going to happen, but, like, thinking of this moment not just as, March 5th, 2022. This is a moment this is March 5th, 2022, tacked on to 1,500 years of other days that where all these decisions by Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, all these, everything, all of these decisions led you and me to talk today about some context around what's happening in Ukraine. Where?
I mean, can I say how I can talk about how my family thinks this is the only way it could end. Mm-hmm. Can I talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. And again, I'm not. There's no right answer here. I want your genuine feelings on March 5th, 2022.
So we think that the only way this war will end is if Russia goes through a complete economic collapse, and when they start having hunger riots. Basically, Russia has to get to that point where people are rioting on the streets because there's no food. Because it doesn't seem like anything else is working. So what all of these sanctions that the West is imposing, it was absolutely the right thing to do. This is going to be huge. So honestly, we're all just sitting there and looking at the course, like the conversion rate of the ruble. We're watching it crash and we're just waiting for all the repercussions. And I think that the only way truly that this can be over in a more permanent way is if Russia stops existing as such a large country.
Tell me more about that. What do you
mean? Well, Russia itself is essentially Moscow colonizing a whole bunch of territory, and Russia includes so many other kinds of people, so many different ethnicities within Russia.
I think if you go to parts of Uzbekistan, where
you don't even have to go to Uzbekistan. Like even places that are officially within the Russian Federation, there are so many different ethnicities there that have been oppressed for centuries, the way that Ukrainians have been oppressed.
The Georgian Caucasus, like that whole
all of that. And even like the people of Siberia, like that's where all of Russia's resources are coming from. That's what they live on. It's the oil, gas. That is one of the poorest regions of Russia. Like there are soldiers coming from there to Ukraine right now who call their mothers after they've been taken prisoner and say, "Mom, their villages here have paved roads and electricity." So I think this is how those people live, and they are the wealth of Russia. Like, if they weren't under Moscow, maybe they could build something better for themselves. So my hope is that Russia will fall apart into bits so that they don't have this humongous might to keep waving a gun at all of their neighbors, and so that all of those bits can actually just get on with living, as opposed to supporting this imperialist narrative that Russia is the best and Russia must rise and Russia must have its high place in the world.
I really appreciate you putting into context some of the idea of Moscow as a colonizer. Like I think I had a sort of surfacey idea or relationship with that particular part of the history, but thinking of Siberia, thinking of Ukraine as these places that are no different than Haiti or Trinidad or Barbados that were colonized by the British and by other people, but mostly by the British, it's a really interesting way that you've made me think about that stuff, and as you're talking, I don't know, if that breakup starts on March 6, 2022, that also could be, there's terrifying repercussions to that, and there's
it's going to be terrifying, yeah. But, Russia is in danger of going back to, pre-World War I levels of standard of living. They're on the brink of that, essentially. Especially the longer they continue fighting in Ukraine, the worse it's going to be for them.
Yeah, and the thing about your point about the sort of breaking the financial back of the Russians, that's usually the way a lot of wars end. Napoleon the way he got out of Haiti, or it wasn't Haiti then, but the way he got out of there was they got bankrupted. The slave rebellions were too expensive. So he sold the Louisiana Purchase to pay it off. And that's why we have the Louisiana Purchase, like,
Right.
we,
Well, I think this is also how America got Alaska. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but Alaska used to be Russian.
yeah, and so you
So-
sell parts of things because you got to pay off a debt. And, look at,
Yeah.
the Russians got bankrupted in Afghanistan. We basically got bankrupted in Afghanistan and Iraq this is what happens.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and just to
Yeah,
wrap
I
up.
should go because I have to interview someone in Ukraine.
Oh my
right
God!
After
Okay,
this, yeah.
I will let you go. Where can folks find out about if they want to learn more information? Where do you recommend they go if they want to help?
Well, if they follow me on Facebook, I am posting things about like here are things you can do. So I have a specific post of just like I think there's like 7 or 8 different ways that people can help depending on where they are financially and psychologically. So if people follow me on Facebook, they can find that information.
Amazing, Anna. Thank you so much for your time. Let's take a rain check on a second podcast where we don't talk about war. We just talk about interesting compositional
Yeah,
techniques
talk
or
about
something.
music. Yeah.
That would be way more fun. But Anna, give my best to your family and your friends, and keep me posted if there's anything else that I should know. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you so
All
much,
right.
Josh.
Take it
It's
easy.
good to talk to you.
Likewise.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. This podcast is brought to you by Liquid Drum, liquiddrum.com down in Waco, Texas. My good friend Todd Meehan runs an amazing percussion company down there. Great merch, great content. Check him out, liquiddrum.com. Also, Kyle Dunleavy, dunleavypans.com, DUNLEAVY pans.com. Kyle Dunleavy makes and builds all the steel drums that I perform and teach on, in So Percussion, as well as at NYU and Princeton. He's an amazing tuner, builder, just a really nice guy, very dependable. Check him out. If you are interested at all in steel pan advocacy, want to learn more about the goings-on in pan in Brooklyn, check out paninmotion.com. My good friend Kendall Williams, Jerry Guy, Trisha Guy, and Arisha John run an amazing organization called paninmotion.com. Check them out. And finally, Alejandro Mirage runs an amazing clothing apparel company in Brooklyn that is steel pan centric. You can check him out at mangochow, CHOW, clothing.com. I own a bunch of his shirts. They're amazing, very stylish, beautifully made. Check them out. mangochowclothing.com. Okay, hope you're well. Talk to you soon. Bye.